So in his later years, the great Chinese thinker Lu Xun did something pretty weird. He famously quit drinking alcohol, which he loved, and he started taking these daily, just foul-tasting doses of fish oil.
Oh, yeah, it's such a bizarre detail.
Right, and he didn't do this out of, like, some sudden devotion to a healthy lifestyle. And it wasn't a desire to, I don't know, spend peaceful twilight years with his family.
No, definitely not.
He explicitly wrote that he did it because he wanted to live just long enough to be a relentless, annoying thorn in the side of his enemies.
Pure spite.
Exactly. He wanted to survive purely to leave a permanent, what he called a defect, in the perfectly polite, compliant world they were trying to build.
Which is just an incredible level of dedication to being a hater.
It really is. So today we are taking a deep dive into the source material, specifically a volume called the Lu Xun Wenji, to explore the mind of this man. A man who looked at his nation, diagnosed a sick soul, and decided the only cure was to become a deliberate, unignorable irritant.
And, you know, that level of calculated spite, it requires a really profound understanding of the society you're dealing with.
How do you mean?
Well, think about a normal medical diagnosis. There's this expectation of precision, right? You break your arm, the x-ray shows a jagged white line, the doctor points to it, it's binary, broken or not broken.
Sure.
But when you step into the world of cultural decay, national trauma, that x-ray machine is completely useless. You're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky. You can't just put a society under a microscope and, prescribe an antibiotic.
Right. And what do you do when the patient, which in this case is an entire nation, doesn't even realize they're sick?
Exactly. They think they're fine.
So for you listening, if you've ever looked around at the world and felt like society's just sleepwalking, or that we're constantly bombarded with these shallow fixes for really deep-rooted problems, you are going to find Lu Xun's intellectual framework fiercely relevant.
Oh, absolutely. His work hits incredibly hard even today.
Yeah. So our mission here is to trace his evolution. We want to see how he went from being a student of Western medicine to essentially a surgeon of the human spirit.
And to understand how a person develops that kind of hardened resolve, the kind that makes you spite drink fish oil, we really have to look at the sudden catastrophic collapse of his early reality.
Right, because he didn't start out as a revolutionary.
No, not at all. He was born Zhou Shuren in 1881 in Shaoxing, and he was born into a scholar official family. So there was status, there was comfort, there was the expectation of a very traditional, prestigious path.
But that reality completely shatters in 1893.
Yeah, it falls apart overnight.
He's just 13 years old.
Yeah.
And his grandfather, who is a high-ranking official, is implicated in this massive bribery scandal and gets thrown into prison.
Which is a huge public disgrace.
Total disgrace. And then, it gets worse, right? 3 years later, his father falls severely ill.
Yeah, and the family is entirely wiped out financially. They spend everything they have on these traditional remedies that, quite frankly, do absolutely nothing.
The sources paint a really stark picture of this period. Like, you have to put yourself in the shoes of this teenage boy. He goes from being the respected son of a prominent family to the kid who has to make daily humiliating trips to the pawn shop.
Just to afford the pharmacy.
Right. He's standing at the pawn shop counter handing over family heirlooms.
Yeah.
And he's enduring the sneers and the sudden coldness of neighbors and relatives who, like a year ago, used to bow to his family.
And when you experience that kind of rapid social descent, the whole veneer of polite society completely dissolves.
It just vanishes.
Exactly. You see the transactional, deeply hypocritical nature of human relationships with terrifying clarity.
And that kind of trauma, it hardens you. It permanently alters your baseline for what is genuine.
It does. And interestingly, the text notes that his refuge during this time wasn't the city or high society, it was the countryside.
Right, out in the fields.
Yeah, he spent time in places like Enkyotu, interacting with rural peasants and just absorbing the raw, unpretentious culture there. And that connection heavily influenced his later stories, like Village Opera,
where the vitality of the common people stands in really sharp contrast to the suffocating rules of the elites.
Exactly. He recognized early on that the official culture of his nation was an elaborate performance masking a deep rot.
But initially, he thought the way to fix this rot was through hard empirical science.
Yeah, he pursues medicine, he excels at the Jiangyan Naval Academy, he reads translated Western texts, and by 1904, he's in Japan at the Sendai Medical Academy.
So he's on a direct path to becoming a medical doctor, armed with the latest Western scientific knowledge.
He is. But then we hit 1906, which the chronology marks as the great pivot of his life.
He abandons medicine entirely.
Completely drops it. He leaves medical school to become a writer.
And the realization he has here it's chilling, honestly. He concludes that curing physical ailments is essentially pointless if the nation's spirit remains numb.
Right. Imagine being a brilliant medical researcher working in a hospital. You have the skills to cure a specific biological disease, but you suddenly realize the entire hospital building is structurally collapsing due to profound corruption.
The administrators are stealing the funds, the foundation is rotting.
Yeah, and the patients are completely apathetic to the roof caving in. You realize that handing out pills in a collapsing building is an exercise in futility.
Wow. Yeah, that's a powerful way to look at it.
Lu Xun looked at his fellow citizens and concluded that you could have a population of perfectly healthy bodies, but if their minds were enslaved, if they were spiritually asleep, what good was their physical health?
They would just be healthy slaves.
Yeah.
Robust spectators to their own national execution.
Exactly. So he trades the scalpel for the pen.
And for the next several decades, his life is just this chaotic blur. He's running from authorities, hiding out in hospitals, in foreign bookstores like the Uchiyama bookstore mentioned in the timeline, and he's just writing relentlessly.
But there's a huge gap between his medical school revelation in 1906 and the fully formed, spiteful cultural critic we see later. We have to look at what was actually happening in China during those intervening 20 years.
Right, to understand why he became so incredibly cynical about polite society.
Yeah. Those 2 decades were marked by massive disillusionment. You had the 1911 revolution that overthrew the Qing dynasty, which, brought a brief moment of hope.
Hope that a modern republic would emerge.
Right. But instead, the country splintered into chaos. It was ruled by opportunistic warlords, while all the old cultural habits of corruption, sycophancy, and intellectual stagnation remained completely intact.
So the labels changed from empire to republic, but the underlying disease mutated and survived.
Precisely. Which brings us to his 1926 essay, The Preface to the Grave, or Fen.
Ah, yes. This is where he introduces one of his most famous concepts.
Yes. In this preface, he reflects on his own vitriolic writing and introduces the metaphor of the soft knife, the Ruan Daozi.
The soft knife. It's such an evocative term. He argues that the hypocritical elites who are constantly preaching peace and moderation and politeness are actually wielding a soft knife.
And the mechanics of the soft knife are so insidious. Think about it. A traditional tyrant comes at you with a real steel blade.
It's terrifying, but it's obvious.
Exactly. You know exactly who the enemy is, and you know you must fight back or die. The soft knife, however, is the pressure of cultural conformity.
It's the polite academic or the smiling official who tells you, now is not the time for anger. We must maintain harmony. Let's just be reasonable.
Right. They use the language of morality to lull you into submission. The soft knife cuts away your individual spirit, your outrage, and your agency, and it does so while convincing you that you are just being a good, compliant citizen.
The victim bleeds out without ever realizing they were attacked.
Exactly.
And that makes the fish oil anecdote from earlier so much more profound. If society uses politeness and harmony to execute your spirit, then being polite back is just assisting in your own murder.
Yes. Lu Xun decides he must be the defect. He has to be the glitch in their perfect, harmonious matrix.
Being a deliberate irritant becomes his survival strategy. Discomfort is the only proof that a nerve is still alive.
By buzzing in their ears, by refusing to be a good citizen in a corrupt system, he forces society to constantly react to him. He prevents the soft knife from smoothly doing its work.
Okay, so if the soft knife of polite conformity was the disease, we have to look at the cures that were being peddled at the time. Because China in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was desperate.
Oh, incredibly desperate. They were being carved up by foreign powers.
Right. And their reaction was this intense, frantic desire to modernize. They looked at the West and said, we need their technology, we need their factories, we need their guns.
And Lu Xun watched this scramble for Western modernization and found it dangerously superficial.
This is where we get into his essays, Lessons from the History of Science and On the Extremities of Culture.
Yeah. He develops a devastating critique of this mindset. He distinguishes between the roots of a civilization and the fruits.
The roots and the fruits. Okay, break that down for us.
To make his point, he traces the entire history of Western science, starting way back with the Greeks. He highlights figures like Pythagoras, Aristotle, and Archimedes.
Okay.
And the vital detail he zeroes in on is that Greek scientific inquiry was overwhelmingly driven by non-utilitarian curiosity.
Meaning They weren't trying to invent a more efficient loom or deadlier spear.
Exactly. They were sitting in the dirt drawing geometric shapes because they possessed a spiritual, intellectual compulsion to understand the fundamental laws of the universe.
The pursuit of truth was the goal itself.
Independent of its immediate economic or military application, Lu Xun argues that this pure intellectual ideal is the actual root of science.
And he traces how this root stalled out during the Middle Ages, was preserved, though he claims mostly just copied rather than expanded upon by Arab scholars.
Right.
And then spectacularly bloomed during the European Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries, with minds like Bacon, Descartes, Newton, and Boyle.
And the contrast he draws with the Chinese modernization movement of his own time is just brutal. He saw Chinese officials and intellectuals acting like people trying to harvest apples by simply nailing them to a dead tree.
Nailing apples to a dead tree.
Yeah. They wanted the powerful fruits of Western dominance, the railways, the telegraphs, the modern weapons, but they completely ignored the cultural and intellectual roots that produced them.
They wanted the machinery without adopting the scientific method, the critical thinking, or the freedom of inquiry that actually made the machinery possible.
Exactly. And he uses an incredible historical example from the French Revolution to illustrate what it looks like when a society actually possesses both the root and the fruit.
The saltpeter story. I love this part.
It's so good. So the year is 1792. France has executed its king, and the surrounding monarchies of Europe have declared war.
France is entirely surrounded, their borders are collapsing, and they are completely out of gunpowder. And they can't just buy it from their neighbors because their neighbors are trying to kill them.
Right. So in a state of pure utilitarian panic, a society without the scientific root would simply be conquered. But France had cultivated a culture of scientific inquiry.
So the mathematician and chemist Gaspard Monge steps forward.
He does. He understands the chemical composition of gunpowder, and he knows that saltpeter potassium nitrate is a key ingredient.
And more importantly, he knows where to find it.
Yes. He knows that saltpeter naturally accumulates in the damp, nitrogen-rich dirt of stables and animal cellars.
Which is just wild to think about.
I know. And Monge doesn't just synthesize it in a lab for himself. He drafts instructions and teaches the entire civilian population of France how to scrape the dirt from their stables, wash it, and extract the saltpeter.
Within days, the entire country is mobilized into a massive, decentralized gunpowder factory.
And that is exactly why Lu Xun loves this story. It wasn't just passionate, flag-waving patriotism that saved France. It was a brilliant, elegant synthesis of science and patriotism.
The root of scientific knowledge resided within the population itself, meaning that when a crisis hit, they could organically generate the fruit they needed to survive.
Precisely. When you only import the technology, you remain forever dependent on the people who actually understand how to build and maintain it.
But Lu Xun's critique went far beyond just hardware and chemistry, right?
Oh, absolutely. He applied the exact same logic to political systems. He watched his contemporaries advocate for importing Western democratic systems, specifically the parliament.
Now, I can hear people playing devil's advocate right now. Like, if a nation is struggling, if it's quite literally fighting for its survival against colonial powers, taking a shortcut makes logical sense.
Sure, pragmatically speaking.
Why reinvent the wheel when you can just buy the engine?
Yeah.
If you want to get rid of an emperor, why not just copy the voting system of a successful republic?
Because installing a democratic parliament in a society that hasn't yet developed the cultural foundation of individual rights is like installing the latest, most sophisticated software onto a computer with a fundamentally corrupted hard drive.
The system is still going to crash.
Exactly. It's just going to crash in a more modern way. Lu Xun warned heavily against the tyranny of the majority.
Right.
If you take a population that's been conditioned for centuries to obey authority and fear independent thought, and you suddenly give them a voting booth, they aren't going to magically become enlightened citizens.
The text translates his warning perfectly here. He says, relying on the uneducated masses or opportunistic elites to run a parliament is simply replacing a single tyrant with millions of scoundrels.
Millions of scoundrels. And his exact phrasing is powerful. He says, casting aside pure materialism to expand spiritual enlightenment, relying on the individual and rejecting the blind herd.
Relying on the individual, that's the key.
Yes. He believed that without the cultivation of individual intellectual freedom, a parliament just becomes a new weapon for the old oppression. The elites will simply use the machinery of voting to legitimize their theft and control.
The soft knife of conformity gets a shiny democratic makeover, but it still cuts your throat.
That's a perfect way to put it.
But this presents a massive philosophical deadlock.
Oh, so?
Well, if importing Western guns won't save the nation, and importing Western voting systems will just create a new flavor of tyranny, what is the actual cure? How do you force a spiritually numb population to cultivate the roots of critical thought? Lu Xun's prescription is wild, especially considering how meticulously he just praised the cold logic of the scientific method.
Right, you'd expect him to advocate for more STEM schools or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But his answer isn't more education or better policy. His answer is poetry.
Poetry. But, and we have to be clear here, not poetry in the sense of delicate rhymes about moonlight and willow trees.
No, not at all.
He was calling for a very specific, aggressive, and highly disruptive artistic energy.
This brings us to his essay on the power of Mara poetry. He looks across the globe to find the exact frequency of energy that China lacks, and he finds it in the rebellious, marginalized romantic poets of Europe.
And the sources explain that the word Mara comes from Sanskrit, translating essentially to demon or Satan.
He deliberately chooses the language of the demonic.
He does. He categorizes these European poets as Mara poets precisely because they were destructive. They were fierce, unapologetic individualists who actively sought to tear down the old stagnant orders of their respective societies.
They were the demons haunting polite society.
Yes. And he contrasts this explosive demonic energy with ancient civilizations, pointing specifically to India and ancient China. He acknowledges their incredibly deep, grand histories, but diagnoses them as having become shadow nations.
Shadow nations.
Yeah.
That is such a haunting descriptor.
Isn't it? A shadow has the outline of something real, but it has no substance, no internal heat. He argued these nations lost their substance because they became obsessed with harmony at the expense of truth.
The text highlights the traditional Chinese poetic ideal of siwuzi, which translates to no evil thoughts.
Right.
For centuries, the ultimate goal of Chinese literature was to be pure, balanced, and devoid of any subversive or disruptive emotions.
And Lu Xun recognized that siwuzi was the ultimate intellectual prison. It was the softest, most effective knife ever invented.
Because if your culture dictates that art is only valid when it is polite and harmonious, then you have effectively outlawed the expression of outrage.
You've sterilized the human soul. A society that can't express anger or conceptualize rebellion through its art will never, ever be able to muster the energy to change its reality.
So to break this sterilized loop, he holds up these European demons as the antidote. And he starts with Lord Byron from England.
Byron is presented as the quintessential Mara poet. I mean, he didn't write about polite society. He wrote about outcasts, pirates, and cosmic rebels.
Right. In works like The Corsair or Cain, he elevated figures who actively challenged God and the universe.
But the crucial detail for Lu Xun wasn't just what Byron wrote, it was how he lived.
Yes. Byron didn't just sit in a comfortable study in London writing edgy verses. He funded rebel fleets, traveled to Greece, and literally died there fighting for Greek independence against the Ottoman Empire.
He backed up his ink with his own blood.
Exactly. Then Lu Xun looks at Percy Bysshe Shelley, another English outcast.
Shelley was completely ostracized for his radical views and his atheism. Lu Xun focuses on Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, where the mythological figure who defies a tyrannical god to bring fire to humanity is framed not as a criminal, but as the ultimate savior.
Shelley viewed the satanic archetype as the bringer of light to a dark world.
Right. And then the analysis moves to Russia, examining Alexander Pushkin and Mikhail Lermontov. And there's a fascinating comparative arc here.
Pushkin introduced that dark, Byronic hero to Russian literature. But as he grew older, he eventually reconciled with the Russian state and the Tsar.
He softened. But Lermontov, however, maintained a bitter, uncompromising rebellion against the hypocrisy of Russian high society until the day he was killed in a duel.
And Lu Xun clearly respects Lermontov's refusal to compromise, his refusal to blunt his own edges.
Absolutely. Finally, he highlights poets from nations that were actively being crushed by foreign empires, which obviously mirrored China's existential dread at the time.
Right. He points to Adam Mickiewicz of Poland and Sándor Petőfi of Hungary.
These men weren't writing abstract philosophy. They were using their art as a weapon for national revenge and liberation.
Petőfi, much like Byron, didn't survive his rebellion. He died on the battlefield in 1849, actively fighting the Russian and Austrian armies for Hungarian independence.
So after laying out this pantheon of bloodied, passionate, destructive European artists, Lu Xun screams his central desperate question to his own countrymen.
He asks, where are China's Mara poets? Where are the spiritual warriors willing to bleed, willing to be hated, willing to be the demons that wake up the masses?
It is a profound demand for a cultural earthquake.
It really is. It's like realizing your entire cultural tradition has been stuck on a loop of soothing elevator music designed to keep everyone calm while the building burns.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Thanks. And Lu Xun is basically cooking over the speakers, demanding aggressive, distorted punk rock. He wants the noise to shake people out of their apathy.
Yes.
But okay, there's an obvious paradox here that we need to address.
Let's hear it.
Lu Xun just spent pages and pages mocking his contemporaries for blindly importing Western science and Western parliaments. Why, then, is he looking to European outcasts to save Chinese culture? Isn't importing Western rebellion just another form of superficial copying?
Huh. It looks like a contradiction, definitely, until you realize that Lu Xun is operating on a psychological level, not a geographic one.
Okay, unpack that.
He wasn't being a Eurocentric follower. He wasn't arguing that European culture was inherently superior. He was diagnosing a universal human archetype.
The Mara poet.
Exactly. The satanic figure, the individual who possesses the sheer force of will to challenge absolute authority and endure the hatred of polite society. He's saying that is a biological necessity for any culture that has become deadlocked.
So he's saying that rebellion is a human root, not a Western fruit.
Precisely. Whether you're in 19th century Hungary under the Habsburgs or 20th century China under warlords, stagnation is the exact same disease, and the Mara spirit is the exact same cure. Lu Xun is perfectly happy to import Western rebellion because the Mara poet represents the ultimate individual critical spirit. That spirit is the fertile soil required before any true science or modern political system can successfully take root.
That completely reframes his relationship with Western influence. He didn't want the shiny paint job of modernization. He wanted the volatile, combustive engine of individual liberation.
Exactly.
But he wasn't solely looking outward to Europe, was he? When it came time to find the authentic voice of his own people, he didn't look across the ocean. He looked downward.
Downward into the literal gutters and bustling streets of his own country's past.
Right. We transition here from Lu Xun, the fiery rhetorical revolutionary, to Lu Xun, the incredibly meticulous literary historian.
Yes. We're drawing now from his detailed study, what was called fiction among the Song populace and its later development.
And the level of academic rigor he applies here is astonishing, especially because he's applying it to a subject that elite Chinese culture considered absolute trash.
Total garbage, yeah. Elite Chinese culture revered high poetry, imperial histories, and Confucian philosophical treatises.
The stuff written in classical Chinese, meant to be read in quiet, isolated study rooms.
Exactly. Fiction, on the other hand, particularly oral storytelling, was viewed as a vulgar distraction for the uneducated masses.
But Lu Xun takes us back to the Song dynasty, into the heart of the urban entertainment districts known as the Huaxi.
And these were not polite, quiet venues?
No, imagine a massive, chaotic night market. The smells of street food, the shouting of merchants, the clanging of coins, thousands of people just packed together.
And right in the middle of this chaos were the Huaben performers, the street storytellers.
These performers were highly specialized professional entertainers whose literal survival depended on their ability to capture and hold the attention of a distracted, moving crowd.
The text categorizes them by their genre specialties, which is fascinating.
You had the silver character tellers, the Yinzi whose domain was the supernatural, ghosts, deep romances, and local legends.
Then you had the public cases tellers.
Right. They were essentially the true crime and martial arts podcasters of their day, dealing with murders, corrupt magistrates, and vigilante justice.
And finally, you had the Iron Cavalry tellers, who delivered sweeping, violent epics of war and conquest.
But what fascinates Lu Xun is the mechanical structure these street performers developed. You couldn't just stand on a soapbox in a loud market and quietly begin your complex narrative.
No, the audience would walk right past you. You had to hook them, force them to stop, and psychologically prepare them for the main event.
This required a highly specific technique that Lu Xun catalogs as the Sheng Tu Wei, which translates roughly to a victory prologue.
It was the mandatory introductory material, the cold open before the main title sequence.
And Lu Xun doesn't just mention that they existed. He breaks down the 4 specific psychological methods that these street performers used to manipulate the crowd, proving that this low art was actually structurally brilliant.
Let's walk through exactly how these methods work because it's so clever.
Okay, so the first method was using a related poem to set the mood.
Right. Before the story starts, the performer recites a rhythmic verse that hints at the themes of love or betrayal to come.
Using the cadence of the poetry to cut through the ambient noise of the market and sink the crowd's attention.
Exactly. The second method was telling a similar, but much shorter, mini-story.
So like a pacing mechanism.
Yes. It allowed the stragglers in the market to gather and settle down without missing the beginning of the actual epic. It warmed up the crowd's imagination.
But the third method is where the genius really shines. Telling an intentionally inferior story.
This is a masterclass in crowd psychology. Why would an entertainer deliberately tell a mediocre story?
Right. Think of a modern rock concert with a warm-up band, or a stand-up comedian dealing with a tough crowd.
By telling an inferior story, the storyteller lowers the audience's baseline expectations.
So when they immediately pivot to this spectacular high-stakes main narrative, the contrast just blows the audience's minds. It makes the main story seem exponentially more thrilling.
It's weaponized contrast.
Weaponized contrast. I love that. And the fourth method is telling a contradictory story.
Right. The storyteller opens with a brief tale about a notoriously loyal friend, only to pivot and deliver a main epic about the darkest, most treacherous betrayal imaginable.
It highlights the core theme through sheer irony.
And these structural mechanisms were developed purely through the brutal trial and error of a capitalist street economy. If the storyteller failed to engage the crowd didn't toss coins, and the storyteller didn't eat.
The sources also point out a crucial detail here. These oral traditions heavily relied on interspersing classical poetry throughout the gritty street narratives.
Yeah. Why do you think that is?
Well, it was a way for the common people to claim the artistic tools of the elites, right? They were taking the high culture, dragging it down into the dirt of the washi, and using it to give weight and flavor to their own lived experiences.
Exactly. And over centuries, these raw street prompts, these huaben, they evolved.
Lu Xun traces how they were eventually collected, refined, and written down during the Ming Dynasty, forming monumental anthologies like Feng Menglong's 3 Words and Ling Mengchu's 2 Slaps.
What started as a desperate attempt to grab attention in a noisy market became the very foundation of Chinese vernacular literature.
Which brings us to a massive overarching quotient that ties this entire deep dive together.
Let's hear it.
We have spent an hour talking about a man whose primary goal was to burn down the old Chinese system. He wanted the demonic European-style rebellion of the Mara poets. He wanted to be the annoying defect in the perfect world. He wanted the cold, hard logic of Western science.
Yeah, he was intense.
Why on earth is this same radical, forward-looking, revolutionary spectral spending immense amounts of academic energy meticulously cataloging how ancient street performers structured their opening jokes? It feels like we're looking at 2 completely different people.
I get why it feels that way. It seems like a massive contradiction until you look at the underlying philosophy of who and what he was fighting for. Lu Xun hated the elite traditional culture. He despised the Confucian bureaucrats, their suffocating rules, their obsession with no evil thoughts, and their deployment of the soft knife.
He wanted to absolutely annihilate that version of China.
Yes. But he possessed a deep, profound, and abiding reverence for the lived, popular culture of the masses.
He respected the people throwing coins in the washi.
Exactly. By treating the history of street storytelling with the same exhaustive academic rigor and seriousness that traditional scholars reserved exclusively for imperial histories, Lu Xun is doing something quietly revolutionary.
He's elevating the voice of the common people.
He is proving, through historical documentation, that the vitality, the creativity, and the true beating heartbeat of Chinese culture was never located in the polite, sterile halls of the imperial courts.
It was in the mud and the noise of the streets.
Yes. It existed in the dynamic, fluid, and highly interactive relationship between a storyteller and their audience. Those performers had to be relevant.
They had to speak directly to the actual fears, the actual anger, and the actual hopes of the regular people standing right in front of them.
And that connection, that raw human vitality, is the ultimate root of Chinese culture.
Wow.
Lu Xun wanted to scrape away the elite rot and graft the modern roots of the scientific method and the Mara poets' rebellion onto that foundational vitality of the common people.
It is a breathtakingly complete vision. He wasn't just a critic shouting from the sidelines. He was a master diagnostician who offered a complete, holistic prescription, even if the medicine he offered tasted like spiteful fish oil.
Yeah, no sugarcoating it.
So let's synthesize this incredible journey. Lu Xun looked at his country and diagnosed a fatal illness. a stagnant, hypocritical elite society that was slowly executing its own people using the soft knife of polite conformity.
He then systematically dismantled the false cures. He watched his nation desperately try to import the fruits of Western technology and parliamentary systems.
And he warned that without cultivating the intellectual and critical roots, these shiny new systems would just become highly efficient tools for the exact same oppression.
So he prescribed the bitter medicine. He called upon the disruptive, demonic energy of the Mara poets, demanding that Chinese artists become the punks, outcasts, and spiritual warriors necessary to shatter the illusion of polite peace.
And finally, he anchored his vision by reminding the nation where its true soul had always resided, not in the dusty, heavily censored texts of the elite, but in the raw, vibrant, and incredibly sophisticated stories of the common people struggling to survive in the streets.
Which brings us to the present moment, and why this century-old diagnosis matters so intensely to you listening to this right now.
Exactly. We live in an era defined by absolute information overload. We have infinitely more access to data, to technology, to the fruits of civilization than any generation in the history of the human race.
But Lu Xun's framework is a stark warning. Collecting all that data, carrying the most powerful supercomputers in our pockets, is utterly useless if you do not cultivate your own internal roots, your critical, independent, and unapologetically individual spirit.
If you lack that critical root, you cease to be an active participant in society and become a passive consumer of whatever the system decides to feed you.
You become the healthy sleepwalker he warned about back in 1906.
And this leads to a final provocative thought that builds on everything we've explored today. Lu Xun believed that true science required a non-utilitarian, pure pursuit of truth, right?
Right.
And that true literature required a demonic rebellion against the comfortable status quo. He believed art had to disrupt. But look at the architecture of our modern digital world.
It's the exact opposite.
It is. We live in an era where technological development is driven almost entirely by immediate profit and utilitarian optimization.
And more importantly, our art, our media, the very stories we consume daily are increasingly curated and even generated by algorithms.
Algorithms that are explicitly designed to maximize engagement by minimizing friction. They are programmed to be as unoffensive, as comfortable, and as easily consumed as possible.
The algorithm is the ultimate perfected iteration of the soft knife.
Yes. It doesn't force you into conformity with a threat. It lulls you into conformity by giving you exactly what you already agree with, ensuring you never have to experience the vital discomfort of a truly challenging idea.
So if Lu Xun were standing here today, would he look at our hyper-connected, technologically miraculous world and say that we have completely surrendered?
Are we so deeply obsessed with the fruits of endless digital convenience that we have willingly let the roots of our own human rebellion wither away?
It's a terrifying question. It makes you realize that perhaps polite society is more dangerous now than it has ever been.
It really makes you want to find your own version of fish oil, swallow it down, and figure out exactly how to become the defect in the system. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope this exploration cut through the noise and gave you a new lens through which to view both history and your own reality. Keep questioning the status quo, protect your roots, and don't be afraid to be the thorn in the side of conformity.